Awesome. Thank you so much, Ruth, and super grateful for your beautiful segue of learning Celeste. I think that was just a great journey that we were all able to go on, and appreciate that kind of context to lead us through the morning. So next up, we'll be watching two videos to kind of set the stage again for our discussions. First, we'll be hearing from Njamba Koffi. He's a dear friend and a longstanding member of TIP, or our kinship as well, and super grateful to hear from him. He's a gifted storyteller, and he'll be sharing a little bit of his reflections on what International Human Rights Day means in the context of our work. And following that, we'll also be watching another video. It's a CTV segment that explores a little bit about the rise in hate across Canada. This video includes personal and also political reflections as well. So it is important to our discussion that we're having today and the relevance of world context in our Canadian context. So just to note, with the second video that we will be watching, just know that some of the content may be triggering. It addresses aggressive and hate-related incidents. So if you ever need to step away from that portion, please feel free to do so. We want to make sure that everyone feels safe and supported during this event. And please hold yourself and hold space for the emotions, the thoughts, and the ideas and the reflections that come from watching both of these videos. And we'll be sharing and discussing these reflections in breakout groups that will be following the discussion as well. So just hold tight. We'll be watching our first video just here with Njamba.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'd be lying if I said I know exactly what today's event is all about. Like, are we celebrating or commemorating? When I think about it, it is with a heavy heart but a hopeful spirit that I share this message with you today as we celebrate the International Human Rights Day and as we commemorate not only the struggles against hate and discrimination, but also the closing of the United Nations declaration, proclamation rather, of the International Decade for People of African Descent. This decade, it's been dedicated to recognition, justice, and development. And it has been a global acknowledgement of the resilience, the contributions, and humanity of African descended people everywhere. For me, as a former refugee and a Black African now living in Canada, this decade has felt both like a declaration of hope, but also a mirror reflecting the immense distance we still must travel to, to realize its goals. My journey to this country was one of survival, hope, and seeking safety. Canada became the place where I came to learn and rebuild my life, where I sought to reclaim my dignity and contribute meaningfully to a society. Yet my blackness, my Africanness, remain a challenge, not in who I am, but in how I am perceived and treated. Over the years, I have encountered barriers rooted in ignorance, in discrimination, and systemic inequities, which serve as constant reminders that safety is not synonymous with freedom, and survival is not the same as thriving. This reality came into sharp focus a few months ago on September 17th when I attempted to travel from like Vancouver to Eswatini to visit my family after so many years apart. I had all the necessary documentation, a Canadian certificate of identity, which functions in place of a national passport for stateless individuals, stateless permanent residents of Canada, or individuals like myself who cannot obtain the national passport from our countries of origin. I had an Eswatini visa, I had all necessary tickets to and from Swaziland, yet Air Canada refused to allow me to board my flight. They insisted I needed the Canadian passport, a document I cannot obtain until my citizenship is processed. Despite my protests and my the presentation of this government issued travel document, I was denied the right to board to continue my journey, citing an obscure travel policy that they couldn't articulate or produce. And in that moment of injustice and confusion, in the 3 hours I spent at YVR trying to advocate for my rights, I felt more alone than I've ever felt, even in times of war and in the various refugee camps I've lived in Africa. What struck me the most about that night, however, wasn't the logistical barrier, it was the humiliation, the sense of being dismissed, and the refusal to see my humanity. It was a stark reminder that even in Canada, the systemic discrimination that disproportionately affects people like me remains entrenched. It was a reminder of how policies that might seem neutral on paper can perpetuate harm, exclusion, and marginalization in practice. I mean, if Air Canada staff couldn't really explain the policies they were basing on refusing meat board, what does that tell about the society we are living in? For me, this was an experience of being both invisible and hyper visible at the same time. Invisible in the recognition of my rights, yet hyper visible as an African, as a former refugee whose presence is often deemed an inconvenience. This experience isn't just about me, it's emblematic of broader systemic issues, hate crimes, and incidences of discrimination in Canada arising. Public Safety Canada reported a 72% increase in police-reported hate crimes between 2019 and 2021, with Black, Indigenous, and Muslim communities disproportionately targeted. Now, these are just the reported numbers. Imagine how many more are not reported. And these statistics aren't abstract. They reflect lived realities, mine included. They expose a dangerous gap between Canada's rhetoric of diversity and inclusion and the everyday experiences of marginalized communities, which, brings me back to the International Decade for People of African Descent. The decade called on nations like Canada to focus on three pillars: recognition, justice, and development. Recognition of the contributions and rights of African descended communities, justice in addressing systemic racism and the enduring legacies of colonialism and slavery, and development through equitable access to opportunities and resources. But as we close this chapter, I want to ask you all here, has Canada or any country really lived up to that promise of this decade? Hence why we commemorate its ending. Anyway, for me, the answer to this question I just posed you lies in what you have seen and felt over the past decade. While there have been steps forward, such as greater public awareness of anti-Black racism, particularly following the tragic death of George Floyd, and some progress in Black representation and leadership and policy making, these strides are overshadowed by persistent systemic inequities. Black Canadians continue to face high rates of unemployment, overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, just like Indigenous peoples, and discrimination in healthcare, education, and housing. And for those of us who are immigrants or refugees, these challenges multiply. We face layers of exclusion that question not just our place in society, but our right to exist here with dignity. Declarations like the International Decade of People for People of African Descent are a call to action, not just symbolic gestures. But we know how that goes with these big United Nations declarations. This decade, for instance, reminded us that systemic racism is not just an individual failing, but a societal one, a product of policies, structures, and attitudes that must be dismantled to create an equitable future. My experience as an African in Canada, hoping to become a Canadian citizen soon, speaks to the urgent need for this dismantling. It speaks to the ways in which recognition, justice, and development remain unrealized promises for so many. So, what now? What do we take from the lessons of this decade and similar declarations in our communities, in our provinces, in this beautiful country? What do we take from these lessons as we move forward? I personally think we must ensure that recognition translates into policy. Acknowledgements are not enough. If you are anything like me, you probably cringe when you sit in those events and meetings which start with land acknowledgement, and that's as far as any meaningful action goes. We must create systems that allow marginalized communities to thrive, free of discrimination and hate, and reform bureaucracies that perpetuate exclusion, whether it's through discriminatory travel policies like what I just experienced, or barriers to citizenship and active, safe participation in the society. Justice must be restorative, not performative. It requires listening to the voices of those who have been harmed, understanding the systemic roots of their pain, and committing to transformative change, I mean. Um, you know, and like all this, like for me, this includes addressing the root causes of hate crimes and ensuring that perpetrators are held accountable. Development must be inclusive and intentional. It means investing in marginalized communities and ensuring that equity is at the heart of policymaking, creating spaces where identities like Blackness and Africanness are not just tolerated, but celebrated, not in one decade or 1 month, like the Black History Month, but all the time. Finally, like as individuals, we must all play a role. Inclusion is not just a governmental policy or responsibility, it is a societal one. It is in the stories we tell, the actions we take, and the communities we build. It is in our willingness to confront our own biases and advocate for those whose voices are too often silenced. Um, yeah, as I close, I want to leave you with this. The International Decade for People of African Descent may be ending, but its spirit live in our actions. Canadians, all the people who live in this beautiful country must not only acknowledge its diverse fabric, but actively weave inclusion, equity, and justice into its very structure. For every person like me who has sought refuge and safety here, for every marginalized person whose identity is challenged, for every community that dares to dream of a better future, we must do better. I'm challenging each and every one of you participating in today's event or watching this video um, to commit to at least one thing that you can do to propel positive change. It could be something as simple as starting to educate yourself and others by learning about the histories, contributions, and challenges of marginalized communities, especially Black, Indigenous, and racialized groups. It could be something like, speaking up and intervening when witnessing acts of hate, discrimination, or microaggressions, ensuring safety and accountability in the moment. It could be supporting grassroots organizations and initiatives working to combat racism and promote inclusion through donations, volunteering, or amplifying their work. It could be advocating for equitable policies by writing to policymakers, by signing petitions, or attending community forums focused on anti-racism, anti-hate, and human rights. It could be creating inclusive spaces in your workplace, in your school, or in communities by challenging bias, promoting diversity, and fostering dialogue among different groups. It could really be anything, but I challenge you to commit to one action. Anyway, now that I have taken so much of your time, let me introduce myself. My name is Njamba Koffi. I'm a son of Africa and a resilient former refugee who has endured various forms of discrimination, human rights violations, hate crimes, and so much. Nonetheless, like many millions like me in this country and around the world, I stand strong, inspired, and doing whatever possible necessary to build um, a better world for my generation and the many generations to follow. I regret not being able to join you today because of my prior work commitments, but please connect with me so that we can share this journey of building a better world. Ruth and the wonderful team at the Inclusion Project can provide you with my details. Thank you so much. Asante sana.
Zara, I'm not sure if the audio is coming through.
Ahmed Kashif looks out onto the alley behind his home in Saskatoon, a place where he came face to face with bad people.
I'm living last 20 years in this country, and some people still in their mind, this country is not my country.
June 25th, 2021. Mohammed is wearing traditional Islamic clothing as he goes out for an early morning walk in his neighborhood. He hears a car pull up behind him. Two men jump out, and then he feels a searing pain.
Someone stabbed me on my back, and I fall down. They took my cane and they hit it on my head. And I put my hand and the stab on my hand.
Mohammed says the two men pinned him down and started slashing his clothes and hacking at his beard. When these men were attacking you, what specifically were they saying to you?
Swearing so much. They told me, why you have this beard? Why are you wearing this cloth? You're not supposed to be here. You are Muslim, and that this is not your country. So much angry. Sorry.
Is it hard to talk about?
You know, they stabbed me on my back, on my arm, and they hit me on my head. I'm okay. But when they cut my beard, they hurt me so much.
He was devastated, to say the least. This represents us in a way. This is our religious identity in a way.
Ali Ahmed is Mohammed's close friend. He says for many devout Muslim men, the beard is sacred.
That was definitely the most terrible thing that can ever happen to anyone. Shows the tremendous amount of hate someone could possibly have in their hearts.
Mohammed blacked out during the laneway attack. He eventually made his way to the front of his house, trying to get help.
5, 6 vehicles passed there. No one's stopped.
So you were standing out here with blood all over you, trying to get cars to stop,
Yeah.
and nobody stopped?
No. Then I lay on my lawn. That's a gentleman. He stopped. He see that like blood's all over, and he called 911.
Mohammed needed over a dozen stitches to sew up the wounds. What did the men who attacked you look like?
He has a tattoo
A tattoo?
on the sides, and it's tall.
That afternoon, Saskatoon police put out this press release calling for witnesses, saying their investigation was in its preliminary stage. That was 2 years ago, and no one has been arrested. And now, with the war in the Mideast, there has been a surge of hate right across the country. In Vancouver,
we've seen an uptick in the number of people who are contacting us who are concerned for their safety.
Like the Israeli-born owner of this restaurant, displaying an Israeli flag and photos of Hamas kidnapping victims.
They walk by and say death to the Jews, go inside my restaurant and say, I wish all the Jewish people dead. And then they run SUVs, black SUVs with tinted windows, screaming from inside, free Palestine. And I say, free the hostages.
In Toronto,
last week in North York, a hate crime investigation was launched after a threat at Tannenbaum Community Hebrew School. On Tuesday in Pickering, police say a man ripped a Palestinian flag off a vehicle and left a note with an offensive message.
many synagogues and mosques across the country are now under heightened security.
Montreal police are reporting 11 hate crimes and hate incidents have targeted Arab Muslim communities. 25 hate crimes and hate incidents have targeted the Jewish community.
In In 2019, almost 1,950 hate crimes were reported to police. By 2021, that number had ballooned to 3,360. That's a staggering 72% increase over 3 years. The crimes range from violent assaults to vandalism.
You rarely see an increase like that in any category of crime. So it really is capturing something else that's happening.
Barbara Perry is a world-renowned authority on hate crimes and right-wing extremism.
For 30 years, you've been tracking hate in this country. And is there ever a point where you just think it can't get much worse?
Well, I think every year when the data come out, I think, how can it possibly get worse? But it just keeps inching up so that we're at the highest level we've ever been.
At the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism at the Ontario Tech University, Perry has been reviewing cases where extreme hate ends in mass murder. And this may surprise you. She says Canada is a world leader.
I've looked at other Western countries to see the number of mass murders or multiple murders that have been associated with the far right or with some of these extremist ideologies. So it wasn't just number of homicides, but the number of incidents. And, you know, per capita, it's one of the worst histories of mass violence in the West, in Canada.
Among the mass murders connected to extremist views, 3 RCMP officers were murdered in Moncton in 2014 by a killer with far-right, anti-authoritarian beliefs. In 2017, the mosque rampage in Quebec City killed 6 Muslim men.
The victims were businessmen, fathers, teachers, and community leaders.
In 2018, a self-proclaimed incel with a rage against women killed 11 people in the Toronto van attack.
I'm thinking that this is it. This is the day of retribution.
In 2021, a suspected white supremacist killed 4 members of a Muslim family.
Police say the family was targeted.
And in 2022, 4 Indigenous women in Winnipeg were murdered, allegedly by a man with ties to a far-right organization.
And each one of them were what I call not lone actors, but networked actors. So they're acting alone, but they all had lengthy histories of consumption of far-right narratives, anti-immigrant narratives, misogynistic narratives.
Not one of those cases resulted in a hate crime charge. In fact, no one in this country has ever been charged with a hate crime. And that's because even though police will declare a crime hate-motivated, there is no specific charge in the criminal code.
One of the things that comes up very often is, do we need standalone hate crime legislation? Some US states have that. We don't have anything like that. And, you know, there are some who argue that maybe that's what we really need. The closest we have is probably the mischief to religious property. That is a standalone. That is a hate-motivated offense, but still, it's not called a hate crime.
The criminal code does have a specific charge for advocating genocide, promoting hatred, and inciting hatred. Judges also have the power to put someone behind bars for longer if hate is a motivating factor in a crime.
So if you are convicted on some other offense, an arson or an assault, the judge at sentencing can escalate the sentence because of the hate motivation, but it's rarely invoked.
But by far, the biggest challenge is catching people who carry out hate-fueled attacks. Many Canadian police services now have hate crime units, but they aren't always effective.